So my name is Redmond, Barton, Tipping, Orpen. The Redmond comes from a friend of my father's who was a surveyor in the Western Cape. He was Major Redmond Orpen, and he had his own private cavalry in the Boer War, which was where my father met him, hence the Redmond. The Barton is my mother's maiden name, and the Tipping is my grandmother's, on my father's side, maiden name. I was born in Petersburg on the 18th of July in a hospital, being the only member of my family to be born in a hospital. All the rest were born at home. My mother walked when she felt her contractions starting. She walked to the hospital at 3 in the afternoon, and I was born in the evening. And that was a very novel idea in those days, to have a baby born in a hospital. I lived only 6 months in Petersburg because my father decided that he didn't like living in the Transvaal, and he wanted his children to be brought up in an English-speaking province. And there was a vacancy going for him in Pietermaritzburg. So when I was 6 months old, we came down to Pietermaritzburg. We lived first in Echo Road, which was really on the outskirts of Maritzburg. And my family had to walk all the time because my father didn't have a government car. My first recollection really was of my brother Marcus putting together a tricycle for me, which was stored in my bedroom during the night of prior to my birthday. And I saw this thing and I thought it was a car. I didn't sleep too well that night, but the bicycle was a tremendous advantage for me. My neighbor child, with whom I was very friendly, didn't have a tricycle. He was very envious. And it was a great advantage for me. Well, being the youngest of 5, I really was very spoilt. I know that, although I did get a whipping once when my family had friends to tea, and our dog, whose name was Buster, was sitting on the edge of the veranda, flopping his tail, and I had a carving knife in my hand, and I chopped the end of his tail off, but he didn't stop waving it, so there was blood everywhere. My father used his razor strap on me. Now the strap was you never see them nowadays, but it consisted of 6 different lengths of either canvas or leather of different thicknesses, and this is what he sharpened his cutthroat razor every morning on. Anyhow, he was very adept at whipping using this punishing tool, having given Marcus and my 3 sisters plenty of hidings. He was rather a bully in that respect. He only gave me one other hiding later in life, but then I was much cleverer and I clung to his legs so he couldn't wield the strop, and he burst out laughing in the end, and I managed to run away with him after me. But I got away. That's the end of the first bit. We have now moved from Long Market Street to Burger Street, number 335, which doesn't exist today. A public library has replaced it. But it was a big upward step for my family to move right into the centre of town. It was easier for Marcus to get to school. When we lived in Long Market Street, he walked to school, which was the boys' model school. in Burger Street, he was going to Maritzburg College, which school I also attended. He had a bike and he used to ride to school every day. We had neighbours called the Smileys, major in the Natal Field Artillery, and Whitty, who was an invalid, didn't go to school, but he worked at home in his workshop. And then there was Norman, who went to Merchiston. Norman and Whitty were very interested in me and used to teach me how to play cricket in the backyard, which is where I developed my interest in cricket. Whitty used to make banjos, real artistic, well-made banjos. What he did with them, I have no idea. Norman was a very good athlete at Merchiston. I don't think he was very bright, but after school he did very well in the Natal Tanning Extract Company. Anyhow, I spent an awful lot of my time in the Smileys' house. Old Mrs. Smiley quite adored me. And Marcus followed in Cecil's footsteps of joining the NFA. I think he joined because there was such a splendid scarlet dress uniform with top boots, a very smart cap. So the next stage of my life really was when I was sent to a kindergarten in Bosher Street. I remember being taken there very unwillingly, not at all happy, but I stayed the day. But the next day, after Marcus had deposited me, I ran home and Mum had to bring me back, which embarrassed her considerably. However, I soon settled in. But then, unfortunately, I got whooping cough and I had to leave school for a few months. When I'd recovered, I was sent to St. Margaret's orphanage, which was very much closer than the kindergarten was. There were 3 boys and a horde of girls, and they took great delight in teasing me and my 2 friends. Our headmistress was Mrs. Lemon. Mrs. Lemon one day told us that day was a very serious day. We were not to make any noise at all in the breaks. We were not to run around. We were all to remain still. Well, of course, children can't remain still. And a good half dozen were nabbed by teachers because they were causing a disturbance. They're all girls, and I remember watching Mrs. Lemon beat them all. I remember seeing the girls being told to bend down, lift up their skirts, and they got a few whacks on their backsides, which of course gave me tremendous pleasure and my friends. It was not done in the privacy of an office, it was done on the veranda of the school. After St. Margaret's, I went to Merchiston. But in 2 days they decided that my grounding was insufficient, ineffective, and my mother was told to take me away and put me back into class 2 for another year. This I did by attending Glenlyn Kindergarten, where I met lots of friends. Ralph Eagle, who is still a friend of mine today, I met him, and Craig Bruce, Michael Barrett was also there. So it wasn't a strange environment that I went into like it was at St. Margaret's, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Whilst I was there, my father asked me if they didn't teach boxing, so I found out that boxing was one of the sports that the children all indulged in. So I was registered as a learner boxer, and boxing lessons took place in the YMCA twice a week. So I remember I used to come home after a boxing lesson and demonstrate to my father how I was taught to do a straight left or a right hook. He was fascinated by all this. At the end of the year, we had a boxing championship, and I proved my father's trust in me. I brought home the cup, which I still have today, which was given to the winner. I don't know how I won it, because I seem to remember that my nose got tonked several times, which made my eyes water. Anyhow, it gave me self-confidence. It was very useful. Years later at Maritzburg College, I took up boxing quite seriously. From Glenlyn, I went to Merchiston, and I was quite in awe of the standard twos. I was in standard one, but the standard twos seemed all such big fellows. Most of them were farmers' sons from Nottingham Road. Didn't like them awfully. But that's where I met Robin McGlew. Now, Robin was Jackie McGlew's elder brother, and he and I were soon fast friends. Although halfway through the year, he formed a gang, and I had my gang, and we used to fight. Fighting always took place at 11 o'clock break at school. Robin was a brilliant sportsman. He created Merchiston records for the 100 metres and the 220 metres, or yards. He played a brilliant game of cricket, batting and bowling. Years later, I discovered that his true father, who was not his mother's legal husband, had played for South Africa. Probably that's where his brother Jackie McGlew also got his talent. Jackie McGlew came to Merchiston when I was in Standard 3. And he showed an unusual talent for batting at cricket. We didn't live very far from Merchiston. To begin with, we were still living in Burger Street, so I had about half a mile to walk every day. But Marcus had brought me a ferry cycle, so I used to ride to school. Now that was very uneventful, because there were truly no cars on the roads in those days. It was tarred, yes, but I can't recall any cars, or cars being a danger. What I do remember very clearly was Oxenham's bakery delivery cart, which was pulled by a magnificent Percheron, a white Percheron. Sometimes he used to come early, and his clip-clop up the tarred road usually was a signal for me to get moving. I made lots of friends at Merchiston. I liked it very much. When I was in Standard 4, which I think was in 1938, It was the centenary of the Voortrekkers' trek from the Cape. And we had to prepare for the arrival of the modern day Voortrekkers. I started riding then, and I was quite good at riding, so I offered myself as one of the welcoming parties that was going to ride to the top of Wells View and meet the wagons as they arrived. This was the most boring ride I think I've ever had. First of all the men spoke Afrikaans and I couldn't understand a word of what they were talking. I didn't think much of their horses. Old Mr. Shaw had lent me a lovely grey, and I was very proud of it. But when the Voortrekkers did arrive, I heard a speech which I could well understand by a famous South African poet, Campbell. And his speech was then cemented into a whole for some future generations to discover. And by the time we arrived home, my bum was horribly sore. But I had managed to borrow a horse for my Afrikaans master, Mr. Erasmus, who never ever showed me any gratitude. However, there were other things in that year. I learned to play a bamboo pipe. My music master was George Robinson, and whilst he was on a trip across Canada, one of the passengers in his compartment pulled out a bamboo homemade recorder and played it for George Robinson. He was so fascinated, he got this man to show him how to make them. When he came back to South Africa, he got together his classes at Merchiston and he made these bamboo recorders. And I was in the band that played at a welcoming concert for the Voortrekkers in Maritzburg City Hall. I had 3 recorders, which I've had for half my life, but now they've gone. And I'm very sad about that because I love playing those recorders. They're very simple and very easy to make. So when all the celebrations for the Voortrekkers was over, my cricketing prowess came to light. And to my surprise, I was put into Merchiston's 3rd 11. And that started many years of cricket for me. Very soon, I was playing for the 2nd 11. And that was in Standard 4. When I got to Standard 5, I was put into the 1st 11. So I could look forward to 2 years of cricket in the Merchiston's 1st 11. I played against some cricketers and with them who've been pretty famous. Jackie McGlew was Springbok captain. Robin Keith was a left-hand spin bowler. And the one chap that I became very friendly with went to Durban Preparatory High School. Now, I'm sorry I can't remember his name. But he took hundreds of test wickets with his off-spin bowling. I can remember his style today. And a thoroughly pleasant fellow. We often played against Durban Preparatory High School, and whenever we did, we'd be taken down to Durban in 2 taxis, and we'd go to Durban Preparatory High School, spend the day there, and then be brought back. I'm sure there were at least 6 or 7 of us seated in each car. It was one of these long, old-fashioned Plymouths that had little seats in the middle. But cricket was my great passion in those days. I used to practice endlessly, batting with a ball in a sock attached to a long string hanging from the tree. I would do that for hours on end. And I taught Jackie McGlue how to make one, so he used to do that at his house. So I consider I contributed just a little bit towards making him famous. Being a member of the first 11 gave one quite status at Merchiston, and I was only in Standard 5. By the time I got to Standard 6, I was made house captain, I was a prefect, and a bit swollen-headed, I'm sure. Anyhow, my time at Merchiston was very happily spent. And when I got to the end of Standard 6, I wrote what was called the PSC, the Primary School Certificate, which I got. I then moved to Maritzburg College. And there my big-headedness immediately caused my downfall. There were 2 prefects, Gins Perry and Anderson. They were hefty blokes, each weighing more than 110 pounds. They played in the first rugby. And my friend Oscar Servant and Peter Holman and Ralph Eagle and I used to get sent for at lunchtime, and they'd take us down to the terraces where they'd cane us. So in my first quarter, I think there were only half a dozen days when I wasn't caned. Why was I caned? For no reason. It's just that bullying was quite bad at Maritzburg College in those days, and our headmaster, John Willie Hudson, publicly asserted that he would be responsible for bringing it to an end, which he did do. His prefects in the following year were all unexpected, mostly academics, but gone were the days when your position in the rugby team warranted your position as a prefect. At Maritzburg College, I was what was called a new gentleman. And all new boys had to go into the quad in the boarding house for their break and await a loud call, "New gentlemen," whereupon we'd all run to the prefect's study, and the prefect needing some sort of assistance, his cricket boots to be polished, or his trousers to be pressed, the tasks were given to new boys, the new gentlemen. The head boy was known as John Nichols. His sister worked with my sister Iris at the SA Mutual, and their father was a clergyman. John Nichols was quite a character. I see him today walking down Church Street with his friends, all wearing white rugby colours blazers and straw bashes on the backs of their heads. But he fixed me once. I can't remember what I'd done wrong, but a prefect brought me by the scruff of the neck to the prefect's study, and John Nichols was told of my crime, and he said, right, I'll fix him. So I had to bend down with my head under the prefect's table and start chiming the 24 hours of the clock, starting at 12 o'clock at night and going every quarter of an hour. I had to chime. And every time I made a mistake, I had to go back to the beginning, and I'd get one hard smack on the bum with John Nichols' hairbrush. I don't think I finished it. When I couldn't take it any longer, and I pulled my head from under the table and ran out of the prefect's study with John Nichols after me, but he gave up. Sadly, he joined the army the following year. We were in the middle of the war, and he walked on a landmine and was blown to pieces. Lots of our old collegians met a similar fate in the war, and at assembly in the mornings, John Willie Hudson, who always conducted the ceremony, would announce the latest casualty. And we would sing a hymn. I can't remember what it was now. A prefect of the day always said the Lord's Prayer in Latin and then read the lesson. And there was a special prayer for when someone was killed. Maritzburg College was a rough experience for me. A gang of boarders had it in for me from third form because I was very interested in debating. I, in fact, became the chairman of the debating society. But they used to call me a namby-pamby because I was interested in debating. Nevertheless, I had good friends, Ralph Eagle, Peter Holman, Oscar Servant, and I can't complain of being bullied. Yes, I was bullied. It didn't do me any harm. Today I think I'm a normal sort of guy. I don't feel any ill effects of being bullied. However, the new order of schools is that not even headmasters can cane. Well, I don't know how many times I was caned by my headmaster. Always because Mr. Baudeur, who was our science teacher, resented my chatting during his lessons. And he'd write me a note addressed to the headmaster, R. Orpen, lacks discipline. And I'd have to take that note to the headmaster, stand outside his door until he deigned to come and ask me what I wanted. Then I'd give him the note, and he'd say, come in. He'd take down his cane, and say, bend, and I'd have two sharp cuts. And I think at least I felt a strong sense of discipline. But Mr. Beaudert, who I became very friendly with after I left school, he's dead now, but he and I got on very well after school. Lots of my masters I became friendly with. There was Andy Stewart. I don't know why he never joined up, because he was the right age. But he was a great lover of good English. He taught us English. And when we'd play a match, a cricket match, usually he'd be on the side with his book of English letters, and he'd read in between overs. He could recite lots of English letters. Charles Lamb's letters he really raved about. Andy Stewart was the only master of his age. He had no contemporaries. All the rest of the masters at Maritzburg College were retired and recalled for the period of the war. So I was really only taught by a lot of old men. Not that I had any objections. I thought so many of them were such super chaps. There was Scratch Leach, who came to Maritzburg College from England when he was 16 and was teaching boys who in those days were wearing beards and were much older than him. And he'd been at college as a maths master all his life. He was now over 60. He came to school one day in a brand new Ford. Obviously at lunchtime, the car was surrounded by boys. And a Scratch came out and exclaimed very loudly, "Don't scratch my car." And that's how he was called Scratch. But a dear, lovable old man. We had other masters who had been at college for some years. There was one famous one. His name was Kaffir Lamond. Nobody knows why he was called Kaffir, but it was never said with any note of derogation in it. He was much loved. He had 5 daughters and 1 son. They lived at Scottsville, and he used to ride to work on his bicycle every day. But before the war, he had a motorbike, which he called his trusty Douglas. When the war came, he couldn't get enough petrol for it. So he took to riding a bicycle with his daughters. He was a great man for testing his willpower. He was very popular with some farmers who used to invite him out on guinea fowl hunts or buck hunts. And on one occasion, he arrived with a heavy bag of tools. And these he kept on his left-hand shoulder. "Why are you doing that, Kaffir? What are you doing it for?" "I'm just testing my willpower," he said. He was a Latin master, and he had friends in England who used to send him the Times crossword puzzle. And if he couldn't do it in 10 minutes, it used to put him into a state of depression. He was the master who organized the daily assembly. He adored his one son, a little redhead, who had sugar diabetes. And I'll never forget the day that we all heard that the son had died. But Kaffa was there, organising everyone as usual. He wouldn't let anything interfere with his sense of discipline. I remember going to play escort in rugby. We went by train, and Kaffa Lemon took us. And I sat in the compartment with him and heard him tell stories of Maritzburg College old boys whose sons had come to the school, and he was trying to explain to me that you were like your father. And he quoted numerous cases of boys who did just what their father used to do. He was killed at 96 years of age when he was standing next to his bicycle at a stop street, Durban Road, which was the bottom of a hill, when suddenly he was killed by a young man driving a sports car. And the whole of Maritzburg went into mourning for that day. Maritzburg College is the second oldest school in the country, the oldest being Sachs. That's the oldest school, and that's in Natal, in the Cape, and both Chester and Oscar Orpen went there. I've been there to watch them play rugby, and it truly is a magnificent old school. Wonderful buildings, and a very obvious vibe one gets from all the boys. Our major competitors in sport were Durban High School and Michael House. Number 3 was Hilton College. And number 4 was Morris Brothers, the Roman Catholic Church in Maritzburg. And they never ever succeeded in beating us at rugby or cricket. But super chaps. Maritzburg College had its centenary in 1943. And on its centenary, we had a school holiday. And Michael House took the day off also to send down a cricket team. So we had a cricket match on our 100th birthday. We beat them because one of our bowlers, whose name was Muir, took 7 wickets for 33 runs. And I was playing in the first 11 in that match. I made 34, which was second highest score. Robin McGlue made the highest score. I think it was 60 odd. But school was such an integral part of our lives. My mother used to come and watch the cricket and rugby matches with Iris. And all sorts of events during the year the families attended, especially the sports day. we had a couple of really first-class athletes. There was a chap called Chaplin, who in those days had the under-18 record for the half mile. I used to worship him. I tried to be a half miler too. And I did quite well, but nothing like him. At college, there was always a small gang of smokers, and they were usually the rebels. Smoking was severely frowned upon, not because of its ill health that it created, but because you were just not supposed to smoke. We didn't know in those days what smoking did to you. Had we known, I'm sure many of those who smoked would have given up. I tried my hand at boxing at college, and I did quite good because I had one of the seniors took an interest in me, and his name was Laurie Backhouse. His father owned a big printing works in Maritzburg. And Laurie Backhouse was in his weight, a very lightweight, he was the South African schools champion. And one night, I was put up against another chap he was in a higher form. Brian Hall was his name. Well, Brian, I don't know why I was put against him, because he was a terrible killer. But I remember starting off the bout with him, and the next thing I remember was a flash in my eyes, and lying on the floor, and the headmaster saying, "No guard at all, no guard at all." I think that's when I decided that really boxing was not meant for me. Andy Stewart was very upset when I told him I was giving it up. And he begged me just to give it one more chance with the cadet championships, which were being held in Durban. And I agreed. So when we went down, the first thing we did was weigh ourselves. And I was 1.5 pounds too heavy for my weight. And then Brian Hall's father came along and said he'd get it off. So he took me to the Durban Corporation steam baths, where I steamed for nearly 2 days, but I didn't lose the weight. The result was that I was in the weight above my category and facing a chap from Voortrekker high. Well, it didn't last too long. I got flattened. But I did land a few good punches to that bloke's head, who later I encountered when I was playing rugby, and he was the fullback for the Voortrekker side. When he saw me, he just laughed. So, Maritzburg College eventually came to an end. And that's when the beginning of my adult life started. But I started off life with some political leanings. And on speech day, when I was in 5th form, George Thompson was meant to give the speech. But when he stood on the platform, he had a memory loss. He couldn't remember a single word of his speech. But Lynn Rutherford jumped to his feet and called on everyone to cheer the man who was giving our prizes. So the next year, John Willie Hudson sent for me, and I wondered what I'd done wrong. I got to his office and he said, "Come in, I've got a surprise for you. You are going to make the speech on final day." So I had to make the speech, which I prepared in advance, a very short one, but I read it so many times I could have dreamed it. Then on the day of the speech, I pressed my trousers with beautiful knife-edge creases and my best starched collar, and the man giving the speeches was Mr. Mitchell, Douglas Mitchell, who was the leader of the United Party in Natal and a key member of Smuts's United Party. Anyhow, I said all the right things for him. And when the speech was over, he came up to me and he said, "Now, young man, I've got a future for you in politics. Make sure you keep close to my son." His name was Rat Mitchell, and he was one of my good friends. I had many encounters with Douglas Mitchell after that, including asking him to stand down as leader of the United Party in Natal. But he wouldn't take my advice, sadly. So I remember that last speech day with much pleasure, because after I'd made my speech, all sorts of people came up and congratulated me. It was really the first time I'd ever made a public speech. I'd made speeches in debating society matches with other schools, but never to a whole crowd of adults. I went to Natal University. When I started at Maritzburg College, I signed on for the engineering faculty because I wanted to become a civil engineer. So I was in the E class, which was E for engineering, all 4 years. We did advanced mathematics and civil engineering, drawing and design, all of which I liked immensely. And I was quite good in advanced maths. I remember I got a C for it and a B for my ordinary maths. So I automatically signed up at Natal University College for the engineer, for a BSc. And to my utter horror, when I attended maths classes, I didn't know what the hell they were talking about. And very quickly I got left behind, but I attended every lecture and yawned my way through it. And when it came to the end of the year, I said to my mother, I wasn't carrying on with a BSc. I wanted to do a BA, which in those days was considered quite easy. I did pass chemistry and physics, and the civil engineering drawing, but I failed maths. And in those days you had to pass 4 subjects to go up. So I couldn't have gone up anyhow. Wouldn't have mattered anything, because I just didn't understand the maths. So I started off second year with a BA, doing English and Hollands, because I wanted to join the diplomatic corps. And in those days, if you could speak Dutch, as it was called, you would get a very quick promotion in the diplomatic department. But I'm afraid my heart was never in classes. I was far too interested in girls. I had quite an affair with our French mistress. When it came to writing my French exam, I knew very little. I can't even remember her name today, but she was such a lovely thing. I also had a sweetheart. Her name was Erica Chapman. I still see her today. She married Jerry Drummond, a doctor. He's now dead. And I see Erica occasionally. I must talk about Edgar Milborough. He was an old collegian from a Maritzburg family. He went to Maritzburg College, and after that came the First World War, and he signed up for it, and he was badly wounded in it, especially around the head. But he recovered, and it did something to his entrepreneurial senses, because he very quickly got into private business. He was running a transport business using mules. You can't imagine what that's like. But he had this transport business between Maritzburg and Durban. He didn't have trucks, he had mules. Well, he did so well in that, he moved on to other businesses. And today there is a company in existence being run by his son, or perhaps his grandson, called Milborough's Pet Medicines. Well, he lived right opposite Erica's house. Erica was my girlfriend. And he loved horse riding, and he had a number of horses, which Erica used to ride and I used to ride. And one day he bought a trap, a lovely two-horse trap, which was painted yellow. And often we'd go off on a Sunday for a picnic. Erica and I riding horses, and Erica's mother and Edgar Milborough in the trap. Erica's father was killed or died in the war. And her mother, who was very, very attractive, was very fond of Milborough, and he was a great friend to her. However, all good things come to an end, I suppose. And eventually his wife died and he moved into a flat and sold his 5-acre small holding and all his horses and cows. But his son carried on his business. Yes. His daughter married the son of the Judge President. The Judge President was Mr. Broome, the Honourable Mr. Broome. And Duncan, his son, an old Hiltonian, married, I can't remember her first name, Milborough. But he was one of these fanatics. He was unbelievably obsessed with keeping fit. He played a fantastic game of rugby, and he was one of Natal's swimmers. But he also had an untimely death. They lived down at the coast, and every morning he'd go down and swim in the sea. And one morning, Joan was her name, Joan Milborough, she went down to look for him because he was so late. And all she found on the beach was his towel and his trunks. So he must have drowned or been taken by a shark.